Today is Trinity Sunday. It's the first Sunday after Pentecost, and I think that we sort of understand that going from Easter, where we reflect particularly on Christ and his death and resurrection, and then through this 50 days after Easter, and we think about God the Father and the way in which he has worked in the salvation of humankind, and then we cap it off with the arrival of Holy Spirit. It seems quite natural that we should then move immediately into Trinity Sunday, where we reflect on God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, this triune God, Trinity. I've heard that clergy and preachers generally try to avoid having to preach on this Sunday. For me, I always seize the opportunity because the Trinity is really foundational to my faith. And some of you will have seen this before, but I have I wear a little earring in my ear. It's a Trinity knot, a Celtic Trinity knot. It's a symbol of the Trinity. And on my wrist, I'm not sure if I can get it up there quite so easily, but there again I have a tattoo, which my son actually did. He's training as a tattooist. And this was, I think, his first tattoo that he ever did on a living person. But it's a Trinity knot, an Irish Celtic Trinity knot, a symbol of the Trinity. And I've chosen to physically brand my body with these symbols because I think that they lay an extremely important foundation for Christian living, and they're very foundational for my own personal spirituality and my life in the world. So the lectionary gives us today the reading, the final few verses from Matthew chapter 28. And I just want to read the one verse which we know so well. It's the Great Commission. And in verse 19, Jesus says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Now, of course, we don't hear the word Trinity anywhere in the Bible. That word is not used. It came through a century or two or three later. But we do get these few passages, not many, but these few passages where Jesus or the disciples, particularly Paul, will be writing using Trinitarian language. We get this also, for example, in 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul writes about the one body, the one Lord, the one Spirit, the one faith. So God has revealed God's self to us, to humanity, in a progressive way. God didn't arrive on the stage right at the beginning with Adam and Eve and reveal the whole of who God is. God has revealed God's self to us in a series of waves, if you want, over the centuries, in what we could call a progressive revelation. So in the First Testament, from Genesis all the way through to the end of the First Testament, the Jewish people had only encountered, or only knew that they had encountered God the Father, whom they then referred to as God, as Eloi, as Yahweh. And so this was, that for them, the one God was absolutely central, and the Shema very much focuses on there is only one Lord, there is only one God. And then, around 2,000 years ago, a man appears in the Middle East and presents himself in a way that is completely different from anybody else. And he gathers around him a group of disciples, as did many religious leaders at the time. He gathers a group of disciples around him who realize over a period of 3 years that this is not just an ordinary man, that this man is in fact divine, and that he comes from the side of the Father, and that he was there before the creation of the heavens and the earth, that he has always existed with God the Father. And all of a sudden they're faced with this rather disturbing revelation, which is that God is not one, but two. Wow, mind-blowing for Jesus' Jewish disciples. And then in Jesus' teaching, particularly towards the end of his life, he began speaking about this third person, whom he refers to as another comforter, or another one who will draw alongside, who is Holy Spirit. And actually we get little glimpses of Holy Spirit even in the Old Testament passages. But here Jesus speaks about Holy Spirit as being part of the relationship between him and God the Father. And so all of a sudden it begins to sound like, well, there's actually three people who we can consider God. And Jesus certainly esteems Holy Spirit at the same kind of level as he esteems God his Father. And so by the end of Jesus' life, and certainly by the end of the first century, Christians and theologians have begun to realize that God is not one but three. And this began the struggle that continued for a few centuries of trying to figure out how do we reconcile the math that God is three but one but three. And to be quite honest, we have still not resolved this issue. And you're not going to leave this message today feeling like, oh, now I understand. I've preached often enough on the Trinity and thought, today I really nailed it. Hey, today they're going to walk away and they're going to say, no, I finally get it. Adrian made me understand. And they will walk out greeting, thanks Father Adrian, thanks Father Adrian. I still don't understand. I'm still confused. The truth is, the more we think about this, the more of a headache we get, because the three and the one, in a way, are counterintuitive and illogical. And I think is where faith comes in. But what I hope to cover during this message today is providing some context and explanation for the Triune God, and also to speak about how important it is and the relevance of this doctrine or this theology, both for our personal faith as well as for Christian life. And in fact, not just for Christian life, but for all of human life in this world. So the Latin scholars, who were the people who came from the Western church that was based in Rome in the first few centuries after Christ, tended to work from the one to the three. So they started with the premise that God is one, and then they endeavored to account for how that one could have these three different people, persons, being expressed through it. And this has become and remains in the Western church, so the Reformed, Anglican, Catholic churches, this remains the most prominent way of trying to understand the Trinity. We start with the idea that God is one, and then we try to explain how this one can have three parts. And the problem with this approach is that we come almost always to the heresy of modalism. And modalism is a heresy that speaks about God in a way having three faces, or coming in three modes, three forms, or three ways of engaging with us. And so many of the analogies that people like to use, which I never use, of a clover or an egg or ice, water, and steam, these analogies to try and explain God all start with the idea of one and move to three, and all tend to say that actually there's just one God, but he takes on these different personas at different times. And this conflicts with the understanding that God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit are distinct, and that they have a relationship with each other. And so the 1 to 3 approach I have increasingly found to be an unsatisfying way of making sense of the Trinity. And that the approach that was adopted by the Orthodox Church, so this is now the Eastern Orthodox Church, which includes now today the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, all of those Orthodox churches, followed a somewhat different path. And essentially what they did is that they started with the 3 and then tried to explain how those 3 are one. And this is a really interesting, different approach. They start with the idea that we are presented through the evidence of history and the revelation of God with 3 persons, 3 distinct persons who are described as having their own personality, their own will and volition, and are in communication with each other. And we see this most clearly in the life of Jesus. He has his own views. Sometimes his will and the Father's will are wrestling with each other to see which one will rise to the top. And Jesus periodically talks about the Father and I, or the Spirit and I, will come and dwell in you. And so he speaks about the three persons as if they are three separate people. Then the question is, how can these three separate persons be one God? And the theologians get into using all kinds of complicated terminology around essence and being. But essentially what they argue is that we have three persons who are in fact one being, or one essence, or one ground of existence. And so these are, and this of course can become vulnerable to the charge of tritheism, that we believe in three gods, or polytheism. But I really want to assure you that I certainly don't believe in three gods, and that the Orthodox churches do not believe in three gods. We believe in one God who is comprised of three people. And this is what the word trinity means. Trinity comes from tri-unity, three in one. So the Orthodox theologians have come up with a term called perichoresis. Peri mean around. So it sometimes we use a metaphor of a dance. It is the idea that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, in a sense, are interpenetrated with each other. In other words, that their relationship is so close and so intertwined that although they are still three, they are in fact one being, one essence. And that this relationship that binds them together, the force that enables three to become one, is love. And so at the very heart of God, we have this profound, extravagant, powerful love that is almost like a welding gun that welds the three into one, so that they are still three distinct people, but they are one being, one God. And perichoresis emphasizes that the identity of the three persons of God is rooted in their relationships with one another. And this, in a sense, draws into contrast Western and Eastern ways of thinking about selfhood. And actually, and I'll come back to this, also Northern and Southern ways of thinking about selfhood. In the West, which is, formerly Rome, but now represented particularly by the United States of America, as well as Great Britain, the sense of self, one's self, is defined primarily by your individuality, by how you are separate from everybody else. Your selfhood is defined as what makes you distinct from and apart from everybody else. In Eastern thinking, which is what influenced Orthodox thinking, the sense of self is defined by one's relationships with other people. It is who we are in relationship to our parents, to our siblings, to our spouse, to our children, to our community, to our faith. It's these relationships that define who we are, and that there's really no such thing as a person standing on their own. A person really only becomes a person when they are engaged in and connected with other people. Now, for those of us living in Africa, we know we have a word for this that we use quite often, which is Ubuntu, which can roughly be translated or paraphrased into meaning that we are people through other people, that I am a person through my relationship with other people, not just by virtue of who I am as Adrian as an individual, but rather through who I am in relationship to Trina, my wife, through Aaron, my son, through my colleagues at the university, through my parish at the church, through the other clergy that I have relationships with, through my friends who I have relationships with, my parents and my siblings. All of these relationships constitute who Adrian is as a person. And so when we use this approach to understanding personhood, then the idea of God being three persons and yet one God becomes a little easier, not easy, but a little easier to grasp. That the Son is defined by his relationship to the Father. That the Father is defined by his relationship to the Son and his sending forth of Holy Spirit. And that Holy Spirit is defined as a person through her relationship with the Father and the Son and the way in which she continues their work on earth today. And it is this connection between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit that makes them persons, but it is the intensity of connection, which we really don't experience in human relationships, that binds them together as one God. Now, I have argued, and I continue to argue, that the only force that I am aware of and that I can imagine that is powerful enough to bind three persons together into one being is the power of love. That when love becomes so intense and so passionate that they become one. We get this even in the creation narrative, where the writer tells us that Adam and Eve lay together, they had sex together, and the two became one flesh. And that's why we say when we marry someone, never let these two be torn apart. They have become welded together. They have become one. Of course, we know that we're not really one. We can still fight with our spouse and we still get divorced. But in a sense, it is a shadow or a broken reflection of what is in existence in the Triune Godhead. This powerful, close, intimate relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, that's like a really short introduction to a body of theology that is called social Trinitarianism. Social Trinitarianism. And if you're interested in this and want to pursue it further, I would suggest a good place to start always is Wikipedia. Go to Wikipedia and search social Trinitarianism. And then look for authors like Moltmann and Buff and Zizioulis. These are among some of the key authors that really speak about and unpack a theology of a social trinity. And by social, they mean relational, a trinity that has relationships with each other. And what I'd like to do now is just unpack a little bit what this means for human life and for our day-to-day life. Like, does it really matter? Is this theology really that important? I would say yes, actually it's really, really important. And particularly right at this moment in time, and I really mean this moment in time, this Sunday, it is so important because we see the extent of division and fracturing of human relationships, particularly in the USA. Of course, in many other parts of the world as well. But the violence and the unrest in America around the death of George Floyd and around the prolonged and rolling oppression and marginalization of black people makes a social Trinitarian theology extremely important and relevant for today's moment. But let me start just by saying that, or rather by speaking about what it means for our relationship with God, our personal relationship with God in terms of your own faith. We are relating to a God who is in relationship within the Godhead. This is who we have a relationship with. We have a relationship not just with a God or the singular God, but rather with a community of persons within the Godhead. And so we are in relationship with somebody who really believes in relationships, who's really driven by relationships. And in a sense, what happens is that when God relates to us, we are invited to come and somehow participate in this relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We have this opportunity in a way to not become part of the Godhead, but to engage with and participate in that relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And also, if we understand that that relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit is primarily empowered and driven by love, it means that we are engaging with a God who is extravagantly, powerfully, generously, deeply rooted in love. And that's a God that I really love being in a relationship with. This kind of God is the sort of God that I think we could all identify with and relate to. So in addition to the sort of personal implications of relating to the Trinity and the implication that we can relate to the Father on his own, we can relate to the Son on his own, and we can also relate to the Spirit on her own, so we can really pray to any one of the three because they are all part of the one Godhead. In addition to all of this that's part of our personal faith, there are also profound implications for social life and therefore the church's witness in the world. So I want us to go back to the story of creation, and particularly the creation of humanity. When we read in Genesis chapter 1 about the creation of humanity, we read that God created a man and a woman. God did not just create a man, he created a man and a woman. And the writer of Genesis chapter 1 tells us that God created them in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And what that suggests is that we most embody the image of God when we work together in our relationships with each other. When there is harmony and mutual respect and egalitarianism between us, then we most reflect the image of God. The image of God is not just a psychological construct. The image of God is far more a relational construct. God creates a couple. He doesn't even just create two separate individual people. He creates a man and a woman who are in relationship with each other. And the first thing he tells them is to procreate, to have sex. And a little bit later we learn that when the two have sex, they become one. So in a sense what God is doing is he is creating in humanity the same kind of triune, three-in-oneness that God has experienced since before the beginning of time. God creates a couple. God creates a family. God creates a community. He does not create an individual. And it is this community that embodies the image of God. And so human relationships, as well as our relationships with the world and with God and with everything that we make, all of these relationships are fundamental to the Christian faith and are the things that we should be championing and working on constantly because they are central to the being of God. And if we jump forward just a little bit to Genesis chapter 3, where we read about the fall and we read the consequences of the fall, you will see that each of the consequences is in fact a relational consequence, not just a personal psychological consequence. The woman will experience pain in childbirth. It's about her relationship with her body, as well as with her offspring. There will be conflict between the husband and the wife, and so marital conflict emerges as a consequence of the fall. The man will struggle and sweat to produce crops out of the ground. And so there is conflict and fracturing of relationships between humanity and God's physical creation. All of the consequences of the fall are relational. It's all the consequences are about a breakdown in our relatedness to one another. And why is that? It is because we've become estranged from God, and not just one God, but a God who is essentially relational. So when we sin, what is fractured is our capacity for relationship. It is the capacity for relationship that is central to God. And therefore, when we are fractured and broken and sinful, it is that capacity, fundamentally, that gets broken as well. So I want to encourage you to think about the Trinity in this relational, social way, and to think of it as a model that comes down, in a sense, through the revelation of God as Father and then as Son and then as Holy Spirit into our lives through the writings in the Bible as a model for human society. And that what is so extremely important for us in society is to be in relationships in which there is mutual respect, where there is diversity, but also unity, where we tolerate difference, but we also have common underlying values. And where we are bound together, welded together through a profound and deep love for one another. The kind of love that is constantly self-giving, that we constantly give of ourselves to one another. And so I pour out myself for you in this message, and you pour out yourself for me, or for your partner, or for your friend, or someone at work or at university. And as we pouring out ourselves for each other, as we invest ourselves in our relationships and in each other, and other people invest in us, we are welded together as a community in a similar kind of way to the Trinity. Just a shadow, just a kind of a through a tinted glass. Not clear, not perfect by any means, because we're just broken humans, but something like what we see in the Godhead. Well, gosh, those were a lot of words. And I'm not sure how much of that you are able to grasp. I'm not even sure how much of that I really am able to grasp. Each time I speak about it, I stumble over my words because we really are speaking about things that we do not fully understand. But perhaps if you need to forget most of what you've heard and just think like, sure, what's the one message I can take away from this long spiel? It would be love. And I don't mean just a kind of a mushy, sentimental, sweet sort of love, a television or a Hallmark love. I'm talking about a deep, powerful love that is so energetic and so complete that it welds together three persons into one triune Godhead, into one being. And that this is the center of our faith. This God of love is the center of our faith. And it should inform and enrich and deepen our relationship with God, our relationship with those whom we love in our family and in our church communities. It should also inform the way in which we engage in the world and the kinds of things that we fight for in society. And so I wish you well as you continue to reflect and meditate on, perhaps sleep on or dream about the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.